I will join him to give a bit of response and then to facilitate questions with the audience. Mas Gunawan is famously known as the editor of Tempo, but he's done so many things, from writing librettos to poetry to, well, I'll stop there. The session, oddly enough, is You Will Never Understand. I thought it was his fault for choosing this title, but we don't know who to blame. So Mas Gun will be talking about one of Indonesia's most cherished poets, Chairil Anwar, and will be weaving in, of course, discussions with Latif Mohidin into this. Interestingly, of course, Mas Gun was here last September also to speak in conjunction with this exhibition and project. So I'll hand over to Mas Gun.
Thank you, Ray. First of all, thank you again to Ilham Gallery and National Gallery of Singapore. I'm one of the few people fortunate enough to meet Latif in his early years, and then to be with him in Centre de Pompidou, thanks to the National Gallery of Singapore, and then to the Ilham Gallery. Last one, was it? Okay. The title of this presentation is given by somebody here, which is fun. It's kind of preemptive strike. You never understand. I think, I'm afraid you will understand what I'm going to talk. Pardon me? I don't like titles. Okay. We will be discussing on modernism and everything connected to that, but it's a concept I would like to do without, because modernism, as most critics describe it, is a constellation of artistic and intellectual trends spawned from the European social changes in the 18th century. The Indonesian and Malaysian literary histories that I know have their own rites of passage. My impression is that the word modern in our part of the world has less to do with a time-related paradigm than with a particular way of writing and reading. An Indonesian modernist poet of the 1940s, Chairil Anwar, born in 1922 and died in 1949, it's a very young age, brings with him a different mode of literary expression. Chairil's poetry is radically at variance with that of the Pujangga Baru, the new literary of the 1930s, despite the latter's brand of modernity. The Pujangga Baru, the new literary, as many of you will recall, was a movement determined to uproot traditional literary forms like pantun and syair and hikayat. Chairil and his generation, however, insisted that the Pujangga Baru's modernity was not as open and as bold as it should be. It is quite possible that Chairil's electrifying writings reflect the événement, so to speak, of the 1940s, which is the revolution and the concurrent social upheavals, which could be very violent. For obvious reasons, I cannot speak confidently of Latif Mohidin's modernism as something chronologically related to a similar historical rupture. After all, my grasp of Malaysian cultural history is very limited. Therefore, I prefer an alternative approach. I will invite you to join me, as phenomenologists would say it, to the things themselves, by trying to bracket out assumptions and remain attentive to what is present. In other words, to directly examine the poetry you are supposed to talk about. What strikes me the most in both Latif's poems and Haider's poems, at least the ones I like best, is their quality as condensed, stripped down poetry, utilizing strings of nouns and a few adjectives and infinitive verbs. They eliminate narrative and verbal description, or replace the words that contain concept and ideas with images. Slide number one. Oh, okay. This is a poem Di Hari Pahlawan by Latif Muhyiddin. Di Hari Pahlawan, penuh restu, duduk seorang anak-anak, melihat terpaku, sekuntum bunga, sepatu, dingin dan kaku, dingin dan kaku. Reading the poem is like watching a snapshot, a photography. I find a similar image-based lyricism in many Hairel's poems. Here's a piece of them. Slide 2. Taman punya kita berdua. The park we own, we share. Tak lebar luas, kecil saja. Satu tak kehilangan lain dalamnya. Bagi kau dan aku cukuplah. Taman kembangnya tak berpuluh warna. Padang rumputnya tak berbanding permadani. Halus, lembut, dipijak kaki. In this poem, there's the park, the bench, the flowers, and the grass. But they're all nouns without adjective, but even more pertinently, is an exquisitive it's a beautiful verse of Rendra, an Indonesian poet who was born in 1937 and died in 2009. Slide 3. The poem is called Stanza, and I put a picture there just to stimulate some imagination and to make it less boring. Ada burung dua, jantan dan betina, hinggap di dahan. Ada daun dua, tidak jantan, tidak betina, gugur di dahan. Ada angin dan kapuk, dua-duanya sudah tua, pergi ke selatan. Ada burung, daun, kapuk, angin, dan mungkin juga debu mengendap dalam nyanyianku. Shall I translate them? You just do your own translation, please. Well, in each stanza, things are immediately plucked from the walls. No abstraction. There's birds, leaves, and the kapuk flowers and winds. But they are neither bare natural objects, nor abstraction. The string of things suggests more than its literal meaning, yet avoids overt figurative devices like allegory and even metaphor. They are images, as I said, and an image, like as Ezra Pound describes, and I'm very happy that Pauline mentioned Pound in her presentation this morning. According to Pound, an image is that presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant time. I have a theory that images, like the ones in the best of lyrical poetry, have two elements at play. One is the visual, the other is the unpronounced. Both make the point. I'll give you an example. Boris Pasternak's definition of poetry. So, how he imagined poetry is with this kind of quatrain. It's a whistle, blunt, bright in a trice. It's a cracking of ice in a gale. It's a night that turns green, leaves to eyes. It's a duel of two nightingales. The stanza consists of delicate moments of hearing, dreamlike moments of seeing, all transient, all concrete. It's like a canvas with a Rousseau-like painting, you know, Henri Rousseau, the French surrealist painter. Latif, probably because he is a painter, uses nouns and adjectives to transform his world by infusing the force of visual into it, and even making the oral, the audible, almost visible. That's one poem I like to show you. In this poem, slide number 5, yeah, suara yang tidak dilangsungkan adalah debu hitam. He speaks of suara, sound, as something hitam, black. So he transforms the audible into the visible. Berkumpul di sudut tabir, di bawah buku dan almari setiap malam. Suara yang tidak dilaungkan adalah debu hitam, berkumpul di sudut tabir, di bawah kuku dan jari setiap malam. In another poem, words or phrases are presented, as it were, in their materiality, precisely when there is a quality of enchantment or the magical in their being. Dua kalimat terapung di gaung malam, dua kalimat berpelukan, sepasang degup melambung ke angkasa, Adam tak berkedip menyaksikan. As you can see, the poem speaks of gaung, echo, something we hear, as palpable space in which the two mysterious phrases hang. Then a pair of degup throbbed, something for the ears, bounds to the sky as if you could see their movement. And Adam, believed to be the first human created by God, perceived the flight of the two sentences, dua kalimat, in awe. He watches them without a blink, tak berkedip menyaksikan, and the rest is silence. My reading is this is the way Latif projects Kalimat Shahadat, the diet of Islamic pronouncements of faith, as a moving image in heavens without enunciating it. Images are, as I suggested earlier, visual events. Great lyrical poems remind me of what Jean-Paul Sartre says years ago of the poetic work as microcosm. When the poet joins together several of these microcosms, he says, he is doing what the painters do when they put their colors on canvas. What is he doing is not composing a phrase, but this is just an appearance. The poet is creating a phrase object, phrase objet. The phrase object is painterly to the force. It's an achievement of a painterly manner. Let me quote Latif's painterly approach to nature. Kulukis engkau dengan lumut, kulukis engkau dengan lumpur, dengan kaki-kaki teratai, dengan jari-jari hijau, dengan lidah angin engkau kulukis, dengan bibir ombak engkau kulukis. Kulukis engkau dengan lengang, dengan lenggok-lenggok anak sungai, dengan renangan mabuk anak ikan, dengan derayan daun cemara, dengan tiupan pohon bambu, dengan apa-apa saja yang lembut dan berlaku, engkau kulukis. I have another painterly poem by Hairil Anwar, his famous quatrain, senja di pelabuhan kecil, dusk at a small harbor. Ini kali tidak ada yang mencari cinta di antara gudang, rumah tua, pada cerita tiang serta temali. Kapal, perahu tiada peraut, menghembus diri dalam mempercaya mau berpaut. Gerimis mempercepat kelam. Ada juga kelepak elang, menyinggung muram. Desir hari lari berenang, menemu bujuk panggal akanan. Tidak bergerak, dan kini tanah dan air tidur hilang ombak. Tiada lagi, aku sendiri berjalan menyisir semenanjung, masih pengap harap. Sesekali tiba di ujung dan sekalian selama jalan dari pantai keempat, seduh penghabisan bisa terdekat. The meaning of this poem is very elusive, but you see, the poem grows, as it were, into a panoramic canvas of small harbor at dusk. There is a gudang, a warehouse, a rumah tua, a decrepit shack, ships and stranded boats, kapal perahu tiada beraut, masts and ropes, seagulls clapping their wings, spatters of drizzles, a darkening space. To me, they are the visualization of gloom and stillness, tidak bergerak, dan kini tanah dan air hilang ombak. Immediately, the poem becomes a space pervaded by a body of things that are both palpable and mute. Palpable and mute are words I take from Archibald Macleish Ars Poetica, a very famous poem which he writes as a kind of principle of his aesthetics. This is the dusk and the harbor. Let me read you the poem of Macleish, slide number 10. Yeah? Yeah, a poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumped as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleep-warm stone of casement ledges where the moss gets ground. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. The longer part of the poem, I just delete it because it's going to be very long. Well, the poem is this. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A wordless poem may be an oxymoron, but the idea is not entirely nonsensical. Macleich's piece is composed of many images. The words act more like signals of the presence of some tangible things. They are free from a referential burden. They don't have to refer to anything. The things, the globe, the fruit, the old medallion, the moss, are open and perpetually transient, eluding conceptualization. And as I said earlier, they embody the visual and the unpronounced. They resist the preponderance of language. True, as it's universally accepted, language is a resource a poet has to use to express her or himself, even when she or he is less interested in the communicative role of his or her words. And yet, language is, to borrow Frederick Jameson's metaphor, a prison house. This is especially true when language is considered to be rules a community accepts, which are imposed upon it and not freely agreed to. It's the language philosopher, the very famous one from Switzerland, calls it language. There's a parole and language. Parole is a day-to-day speech. Language is more a system. On the grounds, poetry is an adventure, a process liberating the thing from the constraints of language. In a piece called Credo Poesy, a short manifesto on poetry, the Indonesian poet of the 60s, Sutarji Kalsum Bahri, who was born in 1941, that's my age, arguably the most innovative poet of the 70s, assert his agenda germane to the issue. Okay. Hello? No. Yeah. So you can see it. I'll translate it. Right? Word is not a tool to deliver messages. It's unlike a pipe funneling water. Words are messages per se. Word is free. It is like a chair that is not instruments for sitting, a knife that is not a tool to cut or to thrust. Word should be free from the repressive control of meaning. Bebas dari penjajahan pengertian. Literally, it's colonization of meaning. From the burden of an idea. Words should be free from the rotten tradition shackling a dictionary and other repressive means. Penjajahan kamus, is it? Kamus dan other repression, grammars, and the moral burden the society puts on us, denoting the options and the not options. This is kind of yoke, linguistic yoke, and doctrines, concepts, legal glossary, stock phrases, cliches, and they are too remote from the actual history. They stop being treated as occasions. The cognitive desire for meaning and signification keeps them upstairs to the level of abstraction and controls them. For example, when you say, night. Night, when you make it an abstract word, it becomes a time frame from dusk to dawn. But then you control this word, concept. Poetry should liberate this. And because otherwise, our conversation pass over words as things in process. Words are things in process. As we recycle our vocabulary and treat it merely as a tool, we will never see the process. To borrow Delillo's metaphor in The Body Like Artist, his novel, words like moons in particular phases. Ultimately, with kind of this non-free words, unfree words, which are not free, what we create is a reality encumbered by concept. But in good time, there's poetry, and Stéphane Mallarmé, a French poet, believes that it is the job of poetry to clean up our word-clogged reality by creating silence around things. You see, Mallarmé created this poem, which is, I cannot read. First, it is in French. Second, it's unreadable. And if you can't read it, it's okay. You look at it. It's like Latif Muhyiddin sketches. But there's and this is Sutarji Kalsum Bahri poem. He said when words should be liberated from vocabulary, from the concept. So he draws like Mallarmé does. And a poem by Sitor Sumorang, an Indonesian poet who was born in 1922 and died in 2014. Malam Lebaran, bulan di atas kuburan. A one-line verse. Sitor, as you see, get rid of superfluous words and retain only 5 exact ones. And at the same time, renders only a particular moment, not generality. As I read it, both the graveyard and kuburan and the moon, bulan, have no similar intent. But they make a bizarre and baffling presence. As everyone knows, on the eve of Lebaran, the end of Ramadan, which is the first day of the new month, no moon is visible. This uncommon sight disrupts the normal flow of denotation. The night, the graveyard, and the moon are images of muteness. There's no more logocentric stability. In a way, the one-line verse is comparable to this famous haiku. Again, I'd like to thank Pauline for mentioning haiku in this context. You see, a very famous haiku by Basho. I think it's the 8th century Japanese literary history. Basho in this short, very short poem presents an image of tranquility, of a simple, ordinary movement, and of water stirred by a plant. And in this haiku, language recedes. The question is, where is the meaning? Where one can find meaning when language seems to withdraw, when the verbal constructs are superseded by images. You remember in his Credo Puisi, Sutarji wants to liberate words from the penjajahan pengertian dari beban idea, from the repression of meaning, from the colonization of idea. In other words, from meanings as concept or cognitive graphs. And then you remember, I show you the Sutarji's poem, just like a painting, it's called Tragedy. No, this is not good. Again, yeah, more, yeah. This is called Tragedy Vinga and Siska. Tragedy of Vinga and Siska. That's the words of kawin, vinga, in this word. Shika, kasih, and then it's kaku. You can either read this anagram as a brief love story of Vinga and Siska, beginning with kasih, love, ending with kawin, like many love does, and kaku, death. Or you can see it's a kind of picture, not a series of words that does not mean anything. And it's all right. Maclais is emphatic. A poem should not mean, but be. To be and not to mean is what a tree or a star or Latif's Pago canvas does. It doesn't mean it is. Yet its muteness speaks millions. As they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. To put it differently, one image invites infinite reading. This is especially true today, and you may call it the passing of modernity. When there's no more, to borrow Adorno's word, a soul-providing center of the cosmos. God is dead, according to Nietzsche, and he was worried about it. Because today, what we have is a hysteria that opens the space for total polysemy. Through perpetual conflicts, ceaseless shift of hegemony and authority, This story disrupts human desire to frame the world like a painting or like a definite, well-designed structure, the way a Greek temple was. Living in a period of war, destruction, and the loss of focal point, Haidar Anwar wrote a poem titled 1943. Do you have it? No. Yeah. It's a very strange poem with images which are very disturbing and chaotic. Racun berada di regu pertama, membusuk rabu terasa di dada. The poison is already in the first gulp, and your lungs going decay, and tenggelam darah dalam nanah, blood is sunk in the pool, malam kelam membelam, jalan kaku lurus, putus, candu, tumbang, tanganku benadah patah, luluh, terbendam, hilang, lumpuh. Lahir tegak, bergerak, rupuh, runtuh, mengaum, mengguruh, menentang, menyerang. Kuning, merah, hitam, kering, tandas, rata, rata. Dunia, kau dan aku terpaku. The poem stutters, as Deleuze would say. Language trembles from head to toe. Haidar projects vast images that come and go, leaving no trace of visual coherence. I think Latif suggests a similar topsy-turvy situation, albeit less chilling. This one. 1000 mata kapak mengejar serpian kayu di udara. Masih ada yang belum selesai pada kilasan mata besi. Kilat akan bersabungan, ribut akan bergulungan ke kelereng. Dan selembar salus tajam akan bertebaran menebal di seluruh benua. Anak-anak akan tersentak dari buku cerita melihat 1000 mata kapak mengejar serpian kayu di udara. To me, this is one of Latif's most arresting poems. The starter is less pronounced. In fact, there's a underlying melody in this poem, unlike Haidar's previous lines. But the scene is almost equally surreal. If the meaning may elude us, that is precisely because it preserves the dark side of things. Latif's poetry, his style of repetition, and his quiet elegance can be so soothing that one forgets that there's his other side, in which kelam, darkness, is a sanctuary of freedom. Pauline read the poem, the erotic poem of Latif, Tujuh Lautan. The last stanza is, 7 lautan, 1 gelombang, dibesar perutmu, berpusing denyutan purba, memanggil namaku. Kuturuni bukit, kutinggalkan padang luas, aku merangkak kembali ke lubuk kelammu. A great work of poetry always retains something purba, ancient, even primitive, as a statement against the scheme of modernity. The scheme of modernity and other power that be, in which objects are ordered to have meaning and significance and reduced to their readiness for use. And you can say it about politics, religion, and other things. Thank you.
Let me say a few words, or more than a few words, as a response to what Mas Gun just presented. I'm very interested in how you begin talking about the modern, or disavowing the modern. Let me give another approach to thinking about the modern before we delve into thinking about it in terms of the poetic or the literary and the artistic. Very often, there's an anxiety about the modern in this part of the world. There have been criticisms of the modern in Southeast Asia by saying that we have modernization, but we don't have the modern. I used to live and work in Singapore, in between Malaysia and Indonesia. So let me talk a little bit about Singapore. But it's interesting that Singapore doesn't really connect Malaysia and Indonesia in some ways, right? It's an interesting kind of juxtaposition of these three places, and to think about the modern in these places. There were some Singapore critics who would say things like Singapore's modernization without modernity. And modernization is something that we seem to take for granted. It means the tall buildings, the infrastructure, the capitalism, wealth. But modernity was then posed as the thinking and the questioning. I responded to this kind of discussion of modernization without modernity by actually saying that it's wrong to say Singapore doesn't have modernism, an ideology, because modernization without modernity is a form of ideology. So it is a form of modernism. So what's interesting then when you sort of disavow thinking about the modern because you don't want it to be tied in with so many things, what comes up then is also to think about the comparative. When you were ending and you were quoting, I forgot exactly whom, but this idea of the total polysemy, we are now in a moment of history where we have so many questions coming from so many different directions. Thinking about comparisons has been very useful. And in fact, when you spoke last in Ilham in September, you were making a comparison between Latif and And I remember asking a question about your methodology of comparison. I was thinking about Ben Anderson, so let me just bring Ben Anderson in. Of course, he was a great scholar of Indonesia. One of the last things that Ben Anderson did was that he was working on the final proofs of his memoir, A Life Beyond Boundaries. Interestingly, the book was first presented in Japanese, and it was only later that everybody was persuading him to write this memoir in English. So the theme of translation is also coming up. And of course, translation is so much to do with comparison. I'll quote from Anderson. It is important to recognize that comparison is not a method or even an academic technique. Rather, it is a discursive strategy. There are a few important points to bear in mind when one makes comparison. First of all, one has to decide in any given work whether one is mainly after similarities or differences. It is very difficult, for example, to say, let alone prove, that Japan and China or Korea are basically similar or basically different. Either is possible depending on one's angle of vision, one's framework, and the conclusions towards which one intends to move. A second point is that within limits of plausible argument, the most instructive comparisons, whether of difference or similarity, are those that surprise. A third reflection is that longitudinal comparisons of the same country over a long stretch of time are at least as important as cross-national comparisons. So comparisons across time or comparisons across geography. A fourth point is that it is good to think about one's own circumstances, class position, gender, level of and type of education, mother language, and so forth. At the end of the chapter, Anderson ends with this: good comparisons often come from the experience of strangeness and absences. And I feel that that sentence really resonates with the ending of your own presentation about the primitive in the poem. What I find quite interesting is that in making the comparison between Hyrule and Latif, you also then called forth so many other comparisons with Archibald MacLeish, Sutarji, Mallarmé, and Sitor, and even Basho. And earlier when you began and you talked about not thinking about the modern as a period, most everybody sort of fell into the 20th century, except Basho, you know, the haiku with the frog. And here we get very modernist kinds of questions that these other people were talking about. Archibald MacLeish answering the question, what is a poem? That kind of self-reflection. Or Sutarji, words should be free from the rotten tradition. So you have these two sort of poets making very kind of universal and general kind of statements. But then you have Sitor saying that there should be that specificity and no generality. So it's interesting that there are these contradictions and tensions. But of course, you've managed in your presentation to show how they sit with each other, that they have to do that, the silences and things, and yet they are, of course, done in words. So it's very interesting that we still, in ways that other people have recognized, really talked about these kind of modernist questions in your presentation. But the way that you end it then opens it up, I think, very radically. Again, this kind of total polysemy. And this is where, again, that I'm very appreciative of the kinds of comparisons that you're making and the comparative. And how do we, so to wrap up, my question, not so much, it's not so much a question, but it's a struggle, as it were. I struggle to think how today we think about comparisons in a way that we didn't, the word postmodern we don't use anymore. It seems not very useful. But the way that the modern still sort of hangs around us. So how do we make these kinds of comparisons? How do we think about comparing the modern? Or not using that word and making the kinds of comparisons that we do? And I feel that your presentation today in some ways tries to answer some of those kinds of ways of thinking about comparison. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, man. Comparison is made by with the first step, which is to stabilize two different things, which comparison like reading poetry. It depends on how you this is selection, which one is to be compared. The second is to freeze the process of change. You know, the problem with these labels and theories, they are not open to the fact that what the so-called reality is processes. As there's a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, which says that reality is actual occasions. It's always process. So when you compare China and Japan, Malaysia and Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia, you freeze those entities, and then you select from them which one is comparable, it is not. It's always misreading. Comparison is a reading which is always misreading. That's why I don't really compare in terms of making it a kind of finished product, but as kind of moments in the making. And that leads me to the idea of modernism and modernity. I think people, most people, I understand it, are confused within two terms, with the two terms. Modernity is something which modernism is against. Modernity starts with what the famous words of Max Weber, Einzauberung of the world, this enchantment of the world, where magic is no longer accepted. When the moon is the moon, it consists of something you can land on, something you can measure. There's no magic. It's not like the first human being who sees the moon. A sense of wonderment, there's an enchantment and a magic, and it's lost in modernity. And the second thing is that you start to look at the world as resources. It's something that stands for you to wait to be used, to be instrumentalized. Weber used the word Zweckrationalität, which is instrumental reason. This is modernity. And that's something which ends with some tragedy. The technologizing of the world, everything which we are seeing today, climate change, everything. And then the humanization of the earth. And that's what the philosophers and thinkers in the 20th century started to challenge and question. You remember for the Frankfurt School and the dialectics of enlightenment, which equates enlightenment with destruction and horror. A bit exaggerated because progress can be very couture, but it's the beginning of the rise of criticism of modernity. Then in the 1930s in Europe, the modernism was born. Surrealism, Duchamp, Dadaism, what else? Something irrational, something which is against the instrumental reason. So curiously, modernism in the arts is something which is against modernity. In Indonesia, Takdir Ali Sabana is the father of modernity. He always wants to modernize Indonesia he calls before the word Indonesia, before nationalism, we have only pre-Indonesia. We call it even Zaman Jahiliyah. It's terrible, this Zaman Jahiliyah Indonesia. But his poems, his aesthetics are very much against modernism. Indonesian modernism was born together with Haidar Anwar after the revolution. The impact of the revolution in the cultural life was still not has to be studied, but it's immense. Because in the 40s you have everything. Outbursts of modernist paintings and music and everything. Because the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, and every hierarchy was turned down. The world was completely chaotic and vibrant at the same time. Takdir al-Shaba was not very happy with it. He condemns Haidar Anwar's poetry and literature, and his generation is a production, only producing rujak, something fresh but without vitamins. Well, Takdir was an old generation. He didn't know that rujak was good for your body. At least doesn't bring more cholesterol. But that's Takdir, and he was not happy with all this avant-garde thing. He is the father of modernity, and modernity is followed by political leadership. Sukarno is one, Communist Party is one, another Muslim modern parties are examples of voices of modernity, which is equal to using the instrumental reason to see the world. Maybe that's the destiny of the world, to adopt, to succumb to this onslaught of instrumental reason. And it's the destiny of the arts that's always in the margin. And it's getting alarming when you think about artificial intelligence, what we are going to deal with. As if artificial intelligence will solve everything. But I wonder whether it will create poetry, which it can be programmed to paint like Van Gogh does. But the surprises, the unexpected, the shock of the new will not be there. And that's why modernism is important in that sense. My presentation is, of course, a celebration of modernism, not modernity. But I don't want to use the word because it's always tainted with a certain episteme, a certain paradigm, time-related paradigm.
Another word we haven't used, but of course is loitering throughout, is nationalism. And I think it was quite interesting that the dynamics that you've set up through the contradictions, the dialectical movement, has always been thinking about cultures and even though the word is not used, modernism, it's there, but you seem to be wrestling with that ghost, but less so with the ghost of the nation. And I think that works for me, to think about Hairul as a poet from Indonesia as a country rather than Indonesia as a nation, because of the openness that a country suggests, the way that we think about it, rather than a nation which has that it's not freed from a certain kind of political history. To think about freeing words, you also want to free cultural figures from certain kinds of frameworks. I'd like to open questions to the audience now, but I do want to get back to a question that you raised also about artificial intelligence, but maybe we can come back to that a little bit later. So if we have questions from the audience.
We will never understand, right? So no question.
I'm going to start picking up people. Okay, good. Karim. Karim, you need a mic. Yeah.
I can make a lot of noise. Okay. Mas Gun, I would like to ask something, actually picking up on what you were saying, Weng Choi, about the nation state, about nations. It strikes me that someone like Pak Latif moved across all these different wilaya, all these different places, at a time when the nation state wasn't so formed, so firm as it is perhaps now. Would you like to comment on that? Do you feel that there are more barriers now in terms of the movement of people, and more especially the movement of ideas and how we view the world around us from the 60s when he was moving and when you were obviously very busy at the same time. Are we moving towards a situation when the barriers are that much greater now, or does the internet actually facilitate and make everything so much easier?
Okay, let me begin with the idea of nation. I think it's famous. Ben Anderson said that nation is an imagined community. It doesn't mean it's a fictive unit, but imagining is a process of myth-making, a process of reading and interpreting and deciding. And then it's like from this imagination, the process of imagining, you have a nation. But there are different level kinds of nationhood. And there are different levels and history. I think in this area, in this region, different histories. When Latif came to Indonesia, maybe Malaysians, nationalism was in a very high flux. Singapore and Federation and whatever. While in Indonesia was solidifying with the guided democracy and everything. Nationalism, Sukarno, konfrontasi, things like that. It doesn't touch either Latif or me. We're just friends, and we like poetry, so we forget about the basis of the nation. Today is, well, Indonesian nationalism, if I may say, is a bit lucky in the sense that it was built upon universal values. It's not ethnic nationalism, nothing. It's not religion-based nationalism. Was not because our leaders, our founding fathers and mothers were benign. They are wonderful. But because it's an archipelago, it's more moving, people moving around and intermingling. And the Indonesian Bahasa Melayu was used different words in different areas, same Bahasa Melayu. So there's an element of universality in the nationalism, different from you have in Yugoslavia, Serbian nationalism, or Africa, black nationalism. It's not based on ethnicity. The worrying thing is, since the last 40 years, identity politics has taken over the discourse. Now you have this identity politics based on ethnicity, on religion. In the beginning, identity politics was something useful. Women rights, the blacks. But later on, it became ossified, reified, and become a cult and a danger. And what you have seen in the United States, the racism, Donald Trump, that clown, and a very dangerous clown, and what you see in Europe. The right wing is gaining ground. We may need a different kind of nationalism at the same time universalism, but I don't know how. Sukarno said that our nationalism should grow in the garden of internationalism. I think it's not his original thought, but it's beautiful. I think it was from Gandhi.
I'm also interested in how poets were very important to cultural nationalism in Southeast Asia. So a person like Latif is very much important. It's interesting that today you don't have poets who are part of the larger project of imagining a nation or a country, whereas 2 generations ago you would have had that. And it seems like, is that possibility lost? How does one deal with the problems of the anxieties of identity politics today, whereas somehow poets could speak, and now they seem to have much smaller audiences?
Well, poets bringing forth nationalist ideas was in Indonesia in the 1920s. Muhammad Yamin, he was propagating nationalism. But basically, poets should not do that. It's going to kill the poetry. You better write a pamphlet on Join the Guerrilla.
But I think of it more as a retroactive. So the poet does what she does, or he does, and then much later gets appropriated by a larger kind of national narrative. So not as the poet is the avant-garde of a very different kind of agenda, but in the rear-guard action, they get appropriated for that kind of project.
My experience in Indonesia, nationalism, or the national awareness, if a poetry can contribute something, is make the language alive. Because the language is the only currency and in this nation building, if there's a building at all. But it creates more fluidity in the process. But we should not burden or expect poems, poetry, do that kind of things. No, I will reject it. And it's dangerous too. Poets are not that holy. It can be very dangerous when they're scared to say, and then when you start narrowing down your world, I think it's going to stifle the flow of your poetry. I believe that.
We have to wrap up our session. Is there a question? Yes.
Persoalan saya, Pak, adakah hasil karya penulis Malaysia, termasuk Latif, mendapat perhatian daripada khalayak penulis Indonesia? Coba.
Penyair sering lebih banyak terpisah dari masyarakatnya. Dan saya kira tidak perlu mengeluh atau mencerca. Karena di mana-mana, kecuali di momen tertentu seperti di Rusia. Di Rusia setelah Stalin wafat, penyair seperti Yevtushenko, Voznesensky menjadi digemari banyak orang. Karena tidak ada tempat bersuara bebas kecuali dalam puisi. Kemudian ketika Eropa Timur, negeri sosialis, lebih punya kebebasan bersuara, jumlah peminat puisi juga berkurang. Saya pernah bertanya pada seorang bekas Menteri Kebudayaan Polandia, do people still go to poetry reading? No. Why? Sudah ada television. And television was free, just like in Indonesia. When the television and the press was under the control of Suharto, my magazine was flourishing in a way because we tried to challenge, test the water. But when the television became free, nobody read it anymore, which is sometimes very good. I mean, there's a risk when society adopt points. It's a risk that it will be the other way around. The poets will lose their independence. It become a part of the collective being which can falsify their voices. I think poets should be like hermits. And when you say, then what's your social role? Well, you have social roles. You are a hermit, you write poetry in your room, but when there's a fire, you have to jump. When there's a depression, you have to take the street. But then you write poetry, lyrical poetry about love, about brokenhearted. But you never condemned as being egotistical. There should be a sanctuary in society where silence is appreciated. And today, religion is very noisy. Religion is very noisy. The Sufis died down. That's why poetry, when it's become imbued with religions, only people like Rumi can survive. Others will be finished, become preachers. And we don't need preachers, so many of them. We need poets.
Thank you, Maskun.